How did Latin turn into the different Romance languages? How could one standardized language turn into so many different regional varieties that eventually became their own distinct languages? Why are Spanish, French, Italian, Romanian, Portuguese all so different from each other, to the point where today speakers of those languages can't understand each other? Welcome to Jack of All Languages. I am your host, Jack. Today, we explore the history of the breakdown, the evolution of Latin into over 40 different Romance languages that are still spoken today across Europe and across the world. Today we look at how one of those languages came to be, Spanish. Spanish is the largest Latin language still spoken, with over 550 million speakers, if you include native and non-native speakers. In this series, we're going to look at how Spanish evolved from its parent language, Latin. Let's get started. To begin, let's look back at that second question I asked in the intro. How did one standardized language, Latin, turn into so many distinct, mutually unintelligible languages, the so-called Romance languages? Well, actually, it didn't. In fact, Latin was much more likely a set of related languages and dialects that varied across space and time and social class. In other words, in different parts of the Roman Empire, during different time periods, and in different social groups, the Latin language would have sounded very different. Most people tend to have the wrong idea about this. Most people think, okay, Latin, that's a language. That's one language that was spoken in Rome from the time of Romulus and Remus all the way to the fall of the Roman Empire in the West in 476. That's the language Virgil wrote in. That's the language Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Cicero wrote in. And then at some point, people started speaking Latin badly, and that gave birth to something called Vulgar Latin, which in turn gave rise to the Romance languages, a view represented by this model. This view is very much incorrect. Instead of one Latin language that evolved into the different Romance languages like French and Spanish, there were actually many different versions of Latin. You can call them dialects, varieties, registers, accents, whatever you want. But just as in English today, there are different varieties and accents all over the world, in the Roman world there were just as many, if not more, varieties of Latin. Even in the city of Rome itself, Latin existed on a spectrum. On one extreme, you had what we call classical Latin, basically a made-up language that was considered the most noble, the most correct, and it was spoken by the educated elites exclusively. And then most of the rest of the spectrum is what Christopher Pountain calls spoken Latin, the actual dialect or set of dialects that was spoken out in the streets, in the markets, in the barracks. And this spoken Latin was not a later form of classical Latin. It existed from the time of the Republic all the way through the fall of the Roman Empire. We have an interesting example of spoken Latin versus classical Latin in the modern word for horse in most of the Romance languages. In classical Latin, which almost nobody spoke, the word for horse was equus, giving us modern words like equestrian. However, the Romance languages took a completely different word for their word for horse, caballus, meaning a workhorse or a nag. Caballus gave us these words in the different Romance languages: caballo, cheval, cavall, cavallo, cal, cavallo. We've been talking about languages, dialects, accents, and a couple other terms that might be confusing. Well, these terms are actually confusing for most scholars as well, who don't seem to agree on the difference between, say, a dialect and an accent, or a dialect and a language. Max Weinrich, a Yiddish linguist, famously said that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. What does that mean? Basically what he means is there's no real linguistic difference between a dialect and a language. Instead, it's political power or cultural power that makes us classify some languages as languages and others as dialects. An interesting example is the ancient Greek dialects. Several Greek dialects like Attic and Boeotian were considered prestigious enough to be valid for writing in, thus they received their own names. There were certainly different dialects of Latin. However, because of the prestige of classical Latin, most of these dialects never got named, and they were almost never written in because most educated people were exclusively writing in classical Latin. So these dialects of Latin weren't really documented, but that doesn't mean that they didn't exist. We know that there were different varieties of Latin thanks to inscriptions, literary texts from Roman colonies like Gaul and Hispania, as well as evidence from the present-day Romance languages themselves. Take the word for head in the modern Romance languages. In Spanish, we have the word cabeza from the Latin capitium, meaning head covering, while in French we have tête from the Latin word testa, which meant pot. In Italian, we actually have both capo from capitium and testa from testa. These different words suggest multiple, overlapping varieties of spoken Latin feeding into different Romance outcomes. Okay, so you're probably thinking, this guy still hasn't answered the question. How do we get from Latin, spoken Latin, to modern Spanish? Latin was brought to the Iberian Peninsula by 206 BC, when the Romans defeated the Carthaginians in the Second Punic War and took most of eastern and southern Spain. Their language spread quickly in the south and the east, where they established cities and military bases. The language spread a lot more slowly, however, in the north, in the west, and in the center of Spain. In those areas, bilingualism between local Celtic languages and Latin, or local Basque dialects and Latin, persisted for several centuries. In fact, Latin never fully took over in the Basque Country, where bilingualism between Basque and Spanish still persists today. Ralph Penny, in his History of the Spanish Language, notes that the speed and the quality of Latinization was tied to geography. In other words, if you lived in Spain during the Roman Empire and you lived closer to a bigger Roman city, you were more likely to speak a more cultivated, nobler form of Latin, a more correct form of Latin. Farther from these urban cities, in the rural north and west of Spain, Latin was absorbed later and in a more corrupted form. For the history of Spanish, this becomes extremely important, but we'll come back to that in a minute. First, let's talk about what kind of Latin people were speaking in Spain during the Roman Empire. Hopefully that'll give us an idea of why Spanish is the way that it is. Many scholars have argued that because of the early date of the Roman conquest of Spain in comparison to, say, Gaul, an earlier form of Latin must have been brought over to Spain and preserved in Spain. Many scholars even believe that this early archaic form of Latin would form the basis for the modern Spanish language, making Spanish a more archaic or conservative language compared to, say, French or Romanian. Evidence for this theory includes early Latin words that are still used in Spanish today, but had gone out of usage in the rest of the Roman Empire after the conquest of Hispania. Some examples include hablar from fabulari, cueva from cova, cansar from campsare, and querer from quaerere. Some scholars also postulated that not only did Spanish exhibit a more archaic form of Latin, but it also exhibited influences from other Italic languages, that is, now extinct languages in the same family as Latin that were spoken across Italy during Roman times. One theory is that many Roman settlers in Spain were actually from the south of Italy, where a language called Oscan was spoken, and these settlers would have brought their Oscan language over to Spain and it would have mixed with Latin. Penny argues that it might be this Oscan influence which gives Spanish a different word for to leave than French and Italian. In Spanish they say dejar, where in Italian they say lasciare. He also argues that it could be the Oscan influence that gives us the vowel shift from O to U in words like octubre and nudo. How plausible is all this? The Romance philologist J. Ann Adams wrote an amazing book called The Regional Diversification of Latin, 600 BC to 200 AD, in which he points out some of the problems with this theory of archaism in the Spanish language. According to Adams, the theory that Spanish preserves a more archaic form of Latin and that it features influences from languages like Oscan is not very plausible at all. It turns out the Spanish preserves some archaic Latin words, but it also features a lot of innovations. These include words like tío or tía for uncle and aunt, instead of the newer Latin word avunculus, which gives us oncle in French. And certain archaisms may not have been archaisms at all. Take the word hablar again, supposedly from fabulari or fabulor, meaning to converse. It turns out that other Romance languages either had or still have a version of this word, including Old Occitan, Old French, and some modern Italian dialects. This means that fabulari did not arrive on the Iberian Peninsula and then go out of use in Rome before it could spread to other provinces. In fact, it did spread to other places. It just happened to later go out of use everywhere except for Spain, Portugal, and some parts of Italy. According to Adams, the supposed archaic element of Spanish has been greatly exaggerated. For him, the constant movement between Rome and its colonies meant that the Latin spoken in the colonies would have been changing all the time. Spanish would not have remained static, preserving some archaic speech brought over after the conquest of Hispania during the Second Punic War. Now, to conclude, let's turn back to those corrupted regional varieties of Latin spoken in northern and western Spain during the late Roman Empire. As I mentioned, a more corrupt, incorrect version of Latin would have been spoken in the more rural areas, away from the urban centers of Spain. That's exactly what was happening in the northern meseta of Spain, around the modern city of Burgos. Here, A variety of Spanish evolved from spoken Latin that would later come to be known as Castellano, or Castilian Spanish. In 711, the Moorish people from northern Africa invaded and conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula. They brought with them their languages and their customs, and a new Romance language called Mozarabe, or Mozarabic, was being spoken all across the peninsula now. Thousands of Arabic words were brought into Spanish, and many of them still survive in the language today. However, the Moorish invaders left the northernmost, mountainous, remote areas of Spain unconquered. Here, small Christian kingdoms were formed that slowly became centers of resistance against the Islamic power that was ruling Spain. Slowly but surely, these Christian kingdoms gained power and began to reconquer the Iberian Peninsula, what in Spanish is known as the Reconquista. What does this have to do with the history of Spanish, though? The answer is everything. The languages that these Christian conquerors were bringing with them as they moved south over the centuries were these corrupted northern varieties of Romance, by now hardly intelligible, if at all, to a Roman Latin speaker. Eventually, in the 9th century, these northern Spanish speakers with their strange variety of Romance formed the Kingdom of Castile, and at some point later in time their language became known as Castilian. This early Castilian, of course, is the basis for the language that Spanish speakers speak today. So it wasn't the prestigious, correct forms of Latin spoken in cities in Latin Spain that survived to give us the Spanish language. In fact, it was the set of dialects spoken in the north, corrupted due to distance from Rome, distance from other cultural centers, that give us today's Spanish. Thank you so much for watching Jack of All Languages. Please give this video a like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this one about history, linguistics, language, and culture. There will be a part 2 to this video. In the next video, I'm going to talk about some of the earliest written documents we have in the Spanish language, showing more concretely what the evolution from spoken Latin to Romance to Spanish really looked like. Thank you so much. Until next time, adios. Max Weinrich, a Yiddish linguist, a Liddish linguist,